They were some of the best flyers who ever lived, and that was exactly the problem. Viktor Kovacs was a 3-time national champion whose parachute never opened over China's Tianmen Mountain, pulling him out of the sky in front of hundreds of spectators who could only watch him disappear into the trees. Dean Potter had spent 2 decades turning Yosemite into his personal playground, walking high lines with no safety and jumping off cliffs in a wingsuit, but one evasive turn to avoid a friend in midair sent him straight into a granite wall, leaving 2 of the sport's most iconic names dead in just 22 seconds. And Jonathan Flores, the Birdman of Colombia, with Guinness records, a world title, and more than 4,000 jumps, stepped off Mount Titlis in a new racing suit for what was supposed to be just another training flight, but never made it into stable flight before the mountain reached up and ended his story. They were record holders, pioneers, and professionals, and together their last flights answer a question most people only ask from the safety of their screens. When wingsuit flying goes wrong, how fast does it all fall apart? He was a 3-time Hungarian national champion with over 700 wingsuit jumps under his belt, and on October 8, 2013, Viktor Kovacs stood at the edge of a 700-meter cliff in China, preparing for what should have been just another practice run. But when he pulled the handle to deploy his parachute at 2:51 p.m. that afternoon, nothing happened, and in the 17 seconds that followed, one of Europe's most accomplished wingsuit pilots would become another name on Tianmen Mountain's growing list of fatalities. Viktor Kovacs was 40 years old and had spent 6 years mastering the art of wingsuit flying, racking up not just 700 wingsuit jumps, but also 1,250 skydives and 250 base jumps along the way. He wasn't some adrenaline junkie chasing a thrill. He was a calculated, disciplined athlete who had represented Hungary 3 times as national champion, and now he had his sights set on something bigger, the Second World Wingsuit Championship, organised by the Red Bull World Wingsuit League and scheduled to begin just 3 days later on October 11th. The event was set to take place at Tianmen Mountain National Forest Park in Zhangjiajie, Hunan Province, a location so visually stunning that it had inspired the floating mountains in James Cameron's Avatar. But it was also a place that demanded respect. The cliffs rose 700 meters straight up, the wind conditions were unpredictable, and the terrain below was unforgiving. Dense forest, jagged rock faces, and steep drop-offs that left no room for error. But for pilots like Viktor, that was exactly the point. This wasn't a sport for the cautious, and Tianmen Mountain had already established itself as the proving ground for the world's best wingsuit flyers. Viktor arrived for his practice jump that Tuesday afternoon, alongside other competitors, all of them running through their final preparations before the championship began. 3 other pilots had already completed their jumps that day without incident, gliding smoothly down from the cliff face, deploying their parachutes, and landing safely in the designated zone below. Everything was running as planned, the weather seemed stable, and Viktor had done this exact flight profile hundreds of times before. So when his turn came, he stepped to the edge, ran through his mental checklist one last time, and at precisely 2:51 p.m. local time, he launched himself into the open air. Now imagine for a second you're Viktor. You've got wings strapped to your body and you're standing on a cliff so high that the villages below look like tiny dots scattered across a green carpet. The sun is painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, and your heart is pounding like a drum in your chest. But it's not fear, it's adrenaline, anticipation, the kind of rush that only comes when you're about to do something most people will never experience in their entire lives. You take one last deep breath, spread your arms wide and jump. The sensation hits you immediately. The roar of the wind, the feeling of weightlessness, the ground falling away beneath you as you transition from free fall into controlled flight. You angle your body, adjust your wings, and suddenly you're not falling anymore. You're flying. The wind carries you forward and down, and you twist and turn in a graceful dance with the air currents. Then you're close to the landing zone now, and your hand moves instinctively to the deployment handle. You pull it, but nothing happens. Your throat tightens. Your heart, which had been pounding with excitement just seconds before, now slams against your ribcage with pure fear. You pull the handle again, harder this time, then again and again, yanking it as hard as you can, but the parachute refuses to deploy. Panic floods your body and your mind races through the possibilities: malfunction, tangle, pilot error. But there's no time to figure it out because the ground is coming up to meet you fast and you can't stop it. This was what happened to Viktor Kovacs. People on the ground watched him glide toward the designated landing spot, and then they saw him suddenly veer off course, his flight path shifting in a way that didn't look right. Witnesses watched as he pulled at his deployment handle over and over, but the parachute never opened, and within moments he disappeared into the tree cover below. The spectators stood there, helpless, knowing something had gone terribly wrong but unable to do anything except watch as Viktor vanished from sight. The alarm went out immediately, and what followed was a massive search operation involving nearly 200 firefighters and police officers who combed through some of the most difficult terrain in central China. The cliffs were steep, the forest was dense, and the nightfall only made things worse, but the teams pressed on through the darkness, refusing to give up. The search continued for more than 17 hours, and it wasn't until the next morning, on October 9th, that rescuers finally found Viktor Kovacs at the foot of a 100-meter cliff. He had died from head injuries sustained when he crashed into the rock face, and his parachute, the one piece of equipment that was supposed to save his life, had never deployed. The investigation into what went wrong pointed to two likely causes. Either a sudden gust of wind had thrown Viktor off course and sent him careening toward the cliff before he could deploy his chute, or there had been a technical malfunction with the parachute system itself. Video footage captured by Chinese state television showed Viktor gliding smoothly at first, then suddenly veering off his intended path and disappearing into the trees, but the exact cause of the parachute failure was never definitively determined. What was clear, however, was that Viktor had done everything right. He had the experience, the training, the equipment, and the skill. But in wingsuit flying, sometimes that still isn't enough. The Red Bull World Wingsuit League released a statement the following day saying, "We are deeply saddened by Viktor Kovacs' passing, and our thoughts and prayers go out to his parents and friends during these difficult times. He will always be remembered for his deep passion for life and his spirit of adventure, and he will always be sadly missed in the wingsuit community." The organisation also acknowledged the inherent dangers of the sport, noting that for the last 3 years they had worked closely on safety issues with athletes, manufacturers, and other experts, but that when the world's best compete at the highest level in any sport, the risks can never be completely eliminated. The second World Wingsuit Championship went ahead as scheduled on October 11th, just 3 days after Viktor's death, and the event included a tribute to the fallen Hungarian pilot. But Viktor Kovacs would not be the last person to die at Tianmen Mountain. In January 2017, Canadian wingsuit flyer Graham Dickinson, who had finished third in the 2016 championship, was killed during a training flight at the same location, and in May 2020, a Chinese female wingsuit pilot died after her parachute failed to deploy during a jump from the mountain. Tianmen Mountain remains one of the most iconic and challenging wingsuit flying locations in the world, but it's also a place where the margin for error is measured in inches and seconds, and where even the most experienced pilots can find themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Viktor Kovacs' parachute never opened, and the investigation pointed to either wind or equipment failure. But what happens when two of the world's best wingsuit pilots are flying together, and one mistake creates a chain reaction that claims them both? Dean Potter wasn't just another wingsuit pilot. He was a Laureus World Action Sportsperson of the Year, a National Geographic Adventurer of the Year, and a man who had spent 2 decades redefining what was possible in the world of extreme sports. But on May 16, 2015, just after 7:30 in the evening, Potter and his 29-year-old friend Graham Hunt launched themselves from Taft Point in Yosemite National Park, attempting a proximity flight through a narrow notch in a rocky ridgeline they had flown before, and 22 seconds later, both men were dead, neither of them having deployed their parachutes. Dean Potter was 43 years old and had been a fixture in Yosemite's climbing and base jumping scene since the late 1990s, and by the time of his death, he had accumulated a resume that read like a greatest hits album of extreme achievement. He held speed records on El Capitan's nose route, had free soloed sections of Half Dome's northwest face, had walked high lines suspended 3,000 feet above Yosemite Valley with no safety tether, and had pioneered an entirely new discipline he called free base climbing, where you climb without ropes but wear a base parachute on your back so that if you fall, you can deploy and survive. But Potter was also a controversial figure. someone who had been dropped by Patagonia after climbing Utah's iconic Delicate Arch in 2006 against public sentiment, someone who had released viral footage of himself base jumping with his dog, Whisper, strapped to his back, and someone who had made a career out of doing things that made even other extreme athletes uncomfortable. Still, no one could deny his skill, and when it came to wingsuit flying, Potter was among the best in the world, with a 2009 world record for the longest base wingsuit flight, 2 minutes and 50 seconds covering 4.7 miles from the Eiger in Switzerland. Graham Hunt was younger, 29 years old, but he had become one of the most accomplished wingsuit jumpers in Yosemite, despite the fact that base jumping in all US national parks was, and still is, completely illegal. Hunt was a vibrant figure in the Yosemite climbing community, someone who worked various jobs in the valley and spent his free time launching himself off cliffs in a sport that could land him in jail if he got caught, and he'd flown with Potter before, the two of them forming a partnership built on trust, experience, and a shared understanding that proximity flying, wingsuit flying close to terrain, was as dangerous as it was exhilarating, and that's exactly what they were planning to do on that Saturday evening in May. The jump site was Taft Point, a 7,500-foot promontory that overlooks Yosemite Valley and offers one of the most spectacular views in the entire park. With El Capitan rising in the distance and the valley floor sitting 3,000 feet below. The flight plan was familiar to both men. They had flown this line before, and it required threading through a small notch in a rocky ridgeline, a technical maneuver that demanded precision timing, perfect body position, and an intimate understanding of how your wingsuit would react to the wind and the terrain. Yosemite's Chief of Staff, Mike Gauthier, would later describe it as kind of a trickier flight to go through this notch, which in the language of extreme sports is code for, "This is extremely dangerous and leaves no room for error." But Potter and Hunt knew that, and they had done it successfully before, so when they arrived at Taft Point just after 7:30 that evening, likely timing their jump for dusk to avoid park rangers who would arrest them on sight, they ran through their checks, confirmed their plan with the female spotter they had stationed on the ground, and then stepped off the edge. Now imagine for a second you're Dean Potter. You've spent 20 years of your life in Yosemite, climbing walls that most people can't even look at without getting vertigo, walking lines suspended in midair with nothing beneath you but empty space, and jumping off cliffs in a wingsuit because the sensation of flight is the closest thing to freedom you've ever known. You step off the edge, and immediately the wind takes you, your wingsuit inflates, and you're flying. The ridgeline is coming up fast, and you can see the notch ahead, that narrow gap in the rocks that you need to thread like a needle moving at 120 miles per hour. But then something goes wrong. Graham, flying just ahead of you, suddenly veers off the course and slams into the side wall, his body striking the rock with a force that sends him tumbling, and in that split second, you make a decision. You swerve hard to the left to avoid him, banking away from his trajectory, but now you're heading straight for the opposite side of the notch. You clear it, barely, but your line is all wrong now, and the terrain is rushing up faster than you can adjust, and then, impact. This was what happened to Dean Potter and Graham Hunt on May 16th, 2015. From the moment they jumped to the moment both men died, only 22 seconds had passed, and neither of them had deployed their parachutes because there simply wasn't time. When you're flying that close to terrain and something goes wrong, you don't get a second chance. The spotter on the ground heard two distinct sounds echoing through the valley, and for a brief moment she thought they might have been the sharp crack of parachutes deploying, the sound fabric makes when it catches air and snaps open under tension. She tried to reach both men by radio, calling out their names over and over, but there was no response. So she moved to the predetermined meeting place where they had agreed to regroup after the jump, still holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they had landed safely somewhere out of radio range or had been arrested by park rangers and were sitting in the back of a patrol car answering questions. But as the minutes turned into hours and neither man appeared, that hope began to fade and someone made the call for help. Yosemite Search and Rescue launched a hasty search operation that night, with rangers combing the terrain below Taft Point in the darkness, but the area was rugged, the light was poor, and they were unable to locate either man before nightfall forced them to suspend the search until morning. The next day, a state police helicopter lifted off at first light and began sweeping the area from above, and it wasn't long before the pilot spotted both bodies lying motionless on the rocks below. 2 rangers were airlifted to the site to perform the recovery, and when they arrived, the grim reality was confirmed. Dean Potter and Graham Hunt had both died on impact, and neither of their parachutes had been deployed. The investigation into what went wrong revealed a sequence of events that, in hindsight, seemed almost inevitable given the nature of proximity flying. Graham Hunt had struck the wall first, likely due to a slight miscalculation in his flight path or an unexpected gust of wind that pushed him offline, and Dean Potter, reacting in real time to avoid his friend, had made an evasive maneuver that saved him from one collision but sent him directly into another. Park Ranger Scott Gederman released a statement the following day saying, "This is a horrible incident, and our deepest sympathies go out to their friends and family. This is a huge loss for all of us." And the sentiment was echoed across the climbing and base jumping communities, where Potter and Hunt were both well known and deeply respected. Doug Robinson, a legendary rock climber who was considered one of the fathers of clean climbing in Yosemite, told the BBC, "I was very sad about Dean Potter's death, but not very surprised. He had always sought to take on new challenges, pushing the envelope all his life. But before we continue, kindly like this video and subscribe for more videos like this, and let us know where you're watching." In July 2015, a wingsuit pilot named Uli Emanuele did something that had never been done before. He flew through a 2-meter-wide hole carved into a Swiss mountain at over 170 kilometers per hour, and the GoPro footage went viral with more than 7 million views, turning him into one of the most recognizable names in extreme sports. But 13 months later, on August 17, 2016, Uli was back in the Swiss Alps filming yet another jump for GoPro, this time acting as a cameraman for a friend, and after making a right turn during the flight, he entered an unstable spin, crashed into a cliff face, and died instantly, becoming the 64th base jumping fatality in Lauterbrunnen Valley, a location so deadly that even experienced jumpers call it the Valley of Death. Uli Emanuele was 29 years old and had spent nearly a decade perfecting the art of wingsuit flying, racking up over 2,000 base jumps since he started at age 21 in 2006. And by the time of his death, he had become a full-time professional athlete under GoPro sponsorship, making him one of the few people in the world who could legitimately say they jumped off mountains for a living. He was from Liefers in South Tyrol, Italy, and he had won the Extreme Base Jump World Championship in Spain back in 2010, but it was that cave hole jump in 2015 that truly launched him into the stratosphere of fame. The jump itself had taken 3 years of planning and preparation, requiring Uli to study the terrain, calculate wind patterns, and rehearse the flight path in his mind over and over until he was certain he could thread the needle at terminal velocity. And when he finally did it, GoPro called it possibly the most technical and difficult base jump ever, and the video became one of the most iconic pieces of wingsuit footage ever captured. Uli's entire philosophy was built around exploration and pushing boundaries. His Facebook bio stated, "I focus my job on finding out places never jumped before and searching for new terrain flight lines." And he lived that ethos every single day, constantly scouting new routes, new mountains, new challenges that no one else had attempted. But here's the thing about wingsuit flying deaths that most people don't realize. It doesn't matter how many jumps you've completed, how famous you are, or how much planning you've done. When you're flying that close to rock walls in a place like Lauterbrunnen Valley, the margin for error is measured in centimeters and fractions of a second, and even the smallest miscalculation can turn a routine jump into a proximity flying death. Lauterbrunnen had already claimed more than 40 extreme athletes before Uli arrived that Wednesday morning, and between 2007 and 2016 alone, the valley had recorded 39 fatalities and 98 injuries out of roughly 15,000 to 20,000 jumps per year, which puts the fatality rate somewhere between 0.02% and 0.08% per jump. Those numbers might sound small until you remember that Uli had completed over 60 jumps in 2016 alone, which means he was rolling the dice multiple times a week, and every time you jump, the statistics reset. On the morning of August 17, 2016, Uli posted a photo to his Facebook page showing himself geared up with his helmet, wingsuit and cameras, and the caption hinted at a new jump opening in the Dolomites, a location he had been scouting for his next big project. It was his last social media post. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Uli was standing at the Black Line exit on Murenflug, a technical launch point in the Bernese Oberland section of Lauterbrunnen Valley that was known among base jumpers as one of the more challenging exits in the area. The plan was simple. Uli and his friend would jump together. Uli would fly a few meters behind to capture the footage with his helmet-mounted GoPro, and they would both land safely in the valley below. Now imagine for a second you're Uli Emanuele. You're standing on the edge of Mürenflue with your friend beside you, the Swiss Alps stretching out in every direction. You step off the edge together, and immediately the wind fills your wingsuit and you're flying, adjusting your body to stay a few meters behind him, keeping him in frame as the valley walls rush past on either side. You're tracking his movements, matching his speed, and then he makes a right turn to navigate around a rock formation, and you follow. But something goes wrong. Maybe it's a gust of wind. Maybe it's a split-second miscalculation in your angle. Maybe it's the proximity to the other jumper affecting your airflow. But suddenly, you feel your body start to lose stability. Your wingsuit isn't responding the way it should, and you're beginning to spin, tumbling through the air as the rock face comes up faster than you can process, and there's no time to pull the parachute, no time to correct, no time to do anything except realize that this is it. This was what happened to Uli Emanuele on August 17th, 2016. His body tumbling through the air before slamming into the cliff face at full force. Death was instantaneous, and his parachute was never deployed. Witnesses immediately called emergency services, and state police and rescue teams were dispatched to the scene. But by the time they arrived, there was nothing they could do except confirm what everyone already knew. Uli Emanuele, the man who had flown through a 2-meter cave and made it look easy, was dead at 29 years old. And here's the part that makes this even more tragic. Uli wasn't the only one who died in Lauterbrunnen that day. A 49-year-old British base jumper also crashed in the valley that same afternoon, and according to reports his parachute had opened in the wrong direction, sending him directly into a rock wall. 2 wingsuit crash fatalities in the same location on the same day is rare but not unheard of in Lauterbrunnen, and between 1994 and 2024, 118 base jumping deaths were recorded in Switzerland, and 64 of them, more than half, occurred in Lauterbrunnen Valley alone. The investigation into Uli's death, conducted by the Kantonspolizei Bern, concluded that he had entered an unstable flight position for unexplained reasons during the flight, and while there was speculation that he may have had a mid-air collision or a too close pass with another jumper that caused a fatal distraction, the exact cause was never definitively determined. But 13 months later, the sport would learn the same lesson again, this time with a man who had even more jumps, even more records, and a world record altitude that no one else had ever dared to attempt. Valery Rozov was 52 years old and held the world record for the highest base jump ever completed, 7,700 meters from Cho Oyu in the Himalayas, a 90-second freefall through air so thin that most people would pass out just standing at that altitude. He had jumped from Antarctica, Patagonia, Pakistan, and the Everest Massif, and by November 2017, he had completed 5 of the 7 continents in his quest to become the first person to base jump from the highest point on each landmass. But on November 11th, 2017, while attempting a jump from Ama Dablam in Nepal at 6,812 meters, Rozov had what witnesses described as a bad exit, hit a ledge almost immediately after launching, crashed into the mountainside and fell into a crevasse at the bottom, leaving behind a wife, 3 sons, the youngest just 8 years old, and a legacy as one of the most accomplished extreme athletes in history. Born in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, in December 1964, Rozov had been pushing the boundaries of high-altitude base jumping for over a decade. He had made the first wingsuit base jump from Amin Brak in Pakistan back in 2004, had jumped from the summit of Cherotore in Patagonia in 2008, one of the most technically difficult mountains in the world, and had become the first person to climb and base jump from Ulvatana Peak in Antarctica in 2010, a 2,931-meter needle of rock rising out of the frozen continent where temperatures can drop to -40 degrees and rescue is measured in weeks, not hours. But his true specialty was altitude, the kind of altitude where the air is so thin that your wingsuit barely inflates, where your lungs burn with every breath, and where a single mistake means you're dead before anyone can even think about coming to help you. In May 2013, Rozov climbed to 7,220 meters on Changtse, part of the Everest Massif in China, and jumped off in a specially developed Red Bull wingsuit, gliding down to the Rongbuk Glacier over 1,000 meters below in temperatures of -18 degrees Celsius, and that jump set the world record for the highest base jump ever completed. Then, in October 2016, Rozov went back to the Himalayas and shattered his own record by jumping from 7,700 meters on Cho Oyu, the 6th highest mountain in the world, and the jump was nothing short of spectacular. A 21-day expedition to reach the exit point, 90 seconds of freefall in a wingsuit at an altitude where commercial jets fly, followed by 2 more minutes under canopy before landing safely on a glacier below. It was the pinnacle of his career, and it solidified his reputation as the undisputed king of high-altitude base jumping. But Rozov wasn't content to rest on that achievement, because in 2015, after jumping from Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania at 5,460 meters, he had conceived what he called the 7 Summits Project, a mission to base jump from the highest point on all 7 continents, something no one had ever attempted. By July 2017, he had completed 5 of the 7, adding Huascarán in Peru to his list after a 5-day climb to 6,768 meters, often climbing at night when the ice was more stable, and when he jumped, he descended 2,000 meters in a flight that must have felt like flying through the clouds themselves. That left just 2 continents, Australia and North America, and Rozov was already planning those jumps, already thinking about the next record, the next mountain, the next impossible thing that he could turn into reality. But first there was Amadablam. Amadablam sits at 6,812 meters in the Khumbu region of eastern Nepal, in the shadow of Everest, and it's one of the most beautiful and iconic peaks in the Himalayas, with a distinctive pyramid shape that climbers have been drawn to for decades. For Rozov, this wasn't part of the 7 Summits project. It was a separate expedition, possibly a training jump or a scouting mission for future attempts. And on November 4th, 2017, he posted a photo from Amadablam Base Camp to his Facebook page with the caption Amadablam Base Camp, a simple post that would later be flooded with messages of shock and disbelief from friends and followers who couldn't believe what had happened. 1 week later, on November 11th, Rozov stood at 6,812 meters, surrounded by members of his support team, and prepared to jump. He had done this hundreds of times before. He knew the risks. He knew the altitude would make the wingsuit sluggish to inflate, and he knew that at this elevation, there was no room for hesitation or doubt. So when the moment came, he stepped off the edge. Now imagine for a second you're Valery Rozov. You're standing on a mountain in Nepal. Your heart is steady because you've done this so many times that the fear has been replaced by ritual. Check your gear, check the wind, visualize the line, commit to the exit. You take one last breath of that impossibly thin air and you step off. But something goes wrong immediately. Maybe your body position isn't quite right. Maybe a gust of wind hits you at the worst possible moment. Maybe the wingsuit doesn't inflate fast enough in the thin atmosphere. But whatever the reason, you're not flying. You're falling, and you're falling toward the mountain, not away from it. You see the ledge coming up. You try to adjust, but there's no time, and then impact. This was what happened to Valery Rozov on November 11th, 2017. Witnesses, including members of his own support team, watched as Rozov exited from 6,812 meters and immediately encountered problems, what they later described as a bad exit, meaning something went wrong in those first critical seconds when the wingsuit is supposed to catch air and transition from freefall into controlled flight. Rozov hit a ledge almost immediately, crashed into the mountainside, and his body tumbled down until it came to rest at the bottom of a crevasse. One of those deep fissures in the ice and rock where the temperature never rises above freezing, and the walls are so steep and narrow that reaching the bottom is nearly impossible. The alarm went out immediately, but the reality of the situation was brutal. Helicopters couldn't land in the region due to the altitude and terrain, and the only way to retrieve Rozov's body was to send numerous Sherpas on foot, trekking up to the crash site to perform a recovery that would take hours in sub-zero temperatures at an elevation where every step feels like you're breathing through a straw. The first attempt to recover the body was unsuccessful. The Sherpas reached the site but were unable to extract Rozov from the crevasse on that first trip, and it wasn't until Sunday, November 12th, the day after the crash, that his body was finally brought out and airlifted by helicopter to Kathmandu. The difference between a successful high-altitude base jump and a wingsuit crash often comes down to inches and fractions of a second. And on that November morning in Nepal, Valery Rozov found himself on the wrong side of that equation. Rozov's death sent shockwaves through the base, jumping and mountaineering communities, not just because of who he was, but because of what he represented. Valery Rozov was buried on November 17, 2017, in Zelenograd, Russia, at the Central City Cemetery, and he left behind a wife, 3 sons, and a legacy that will be remembered as long as people continue to jump off mountains in wingsuits. But this next case shows that you don't have to be at 7,700 meters for things to go fatally wrong. Alvaro Bulto was 51 years old, had more than 3,000 jumps behind him, had flown a wingsuit over the North Pole and parachuted in Antarctica, and had literally crossed from Africa to Europe in freefall over the Strait of Gibraltar. So when he stepped off a cliff in Switzerland's Lauterbrunnen Valley on the morning of August 23, 2013, it wasn't supposed to be another entry on a list of wingsuit flying deaths. It was just after 10 in the morning when he launched from an exit known to base jumpers as Dumpster, wearing his wingsuit and accompanied by several colleagues. But for reasons the Swiss police would later describe only as undetermined, his suit never opened properly, his parachute never deployed, and he crashed into the rock below, becoming one more fatal statistic in a month that was already being called one of the deadliest in the history of wingsuit flying gone wrong. But to really understand who Alvaro was, you have to see the contrast. He wasn't some anonymous daredevil. He was part of Spanish motorsport royalty, the son of Paco Bulto, the founder of the legendary motorcycle brands Bultaco and Montesa, the uncle of MotoGP star Sete Gibernau, and a familiar face on Spanish television. For over a decade, he had hosted Frontera Limite, an adventure show on TV's La Dos, where he didn't just talk about extreme sports, he lived them, taking viewers with him as he chased storms, jumped from planes, and stood on windswept summits all over the world. He had been a motorcyclist when he was young. He had competed in rallies like the Dakar, and somewhere along the way that search for speed and exposure turned vertical, and he moved from 2 wheels on the ground to human flight in the sky. By 2013, he had logged thousands of jumps and had turned his name into a brand, Alvaro Bulto, the man at the very edge of sport, and he had the resume to back it up. In 2005, as part of a team with Santi Corella and Tony Lopez, he jumped over the Strait of Gibraltar, leaving Africa behind and landing in Europe in one continuous freefall, treating the sea like an invisible runway beneath him as he surfed the air in a wingsuit. A year later, he became the first Spaniard to fly a wingsuit over the North Pole, threading between ice and sky in a place where a rescue, if anything went wrong, would be counted in days. By 2007, he was jumping in Antarctica, leaping from 3,000 meters into an air mass so cold and clean, it might as well have been from another planet. And in 2009, he set a world record for human freefall flight, 6 minutes and 42 seconds in the air over Las Canteras Beach in Gran Canaria, beating his own previous record from 4 years earlier. He climbed remote Arctic walls, competed in national rally championships, and fronted the Alice project with his longtime jumping partners, constantly looking for the next line, the next stunt, the next way to push human bodies through space just a little bit faster, just a little bit closer to the edge without tipping over it. But the edge has a way of pushing back. 14 years before his death, in 1999, Alvaro had survived an avalanche in Andorra that killed 2 of his teammates while they were heli-skiing for a photo shoot at nearly 2,900 meters, and he walked away from that with the knowledge that sometimes, it doesn't matter how skilled you are, the mountain makes the final call. And then, in June 2013, just 2.5 months before his wingsuit crash in Switzerland, he had another near miss that should have been a warning. As part of a base jumping event in Benidorm, he leapt from the Grand Hotel Bali, the tallest residential tower in Europe, wearing a wingsuit and intending to skim over the hotel roof at about 30 meters and land on the beach. But his parachute turned unexpectedly, and instead of soaring past the building, he ended up landing on the hotel roof itself, far from where he was supposed to be. He walked away with only minor contusions, laughed it off on television, and kept going. The wingsuit flying fatality rate didn't scare him off. If anything, it seemed to reinforce a belief he'd built his whole career on, that risk could be managed, if not eliminated, with enough experience, enough preparation, and enough respect for the air. So when Alvaro traveled to Switzerland in August 2013, he wasn't stepping into the unknown. He was arriving in one of the most famous and infamous valleys in the world of wingsuit and base jumping. Lauterbrunnen, with its sheer cliffs and narrow glacier-carved valley, had already become a magnet for proximity flying deaths, a place where hundreds of jumps a year were performed and where crashes were tragically common. It's the same valley where 3 years later, Uli Emanuele would die, and for many in the community, it's shorthand for how dangerous this sport can be. On the morning of August 23rd, Alvaro and several companions hiked to an exit known as Dumpster, a recognized launch point high above the valley floor in the Steckelberg area. The plan was straightforward: jump in wingsuits, carve through the air along the rock face, deploy parachutes, and land safely in the valley below. It was a type of proximity flight he had done many times before, so as they geared up and checked each other's rigs, there was no reason to think this jump would be any different. But what happened next lasted only seconds and would never be fully explained. According to the Bern Cantonal Police, the suit did not open for undetermined reasons, which is a dry way of saying that something in the sequence, exit, body position, airspeed, wing inflation, failed, and the wingsuit that was supposed to turn his fall into controlled flight never really came alive. Witnesses saw him fall, not fly, and when he hit the ground, he crashed into rock with the full force of a wingsuit, crash at terminal velocity. His parachute never deployed, neither main nor reserve, which meant there was no second stage, no last-minute save, no chance to turn a catastrophic error into a close call. Emergency services were called immediately. A helicopter came into the valley. Responders reached the site, and there, at the base of the cliff, they could only confirm what everyone already feared. Alvaro Bulto was dead. But the timing of his death made it feel even more like part of a pattern rather than an isolated tragedy. August 2013 had already become notorious in the wingsuit and base jumping world. In the 20 days leading up to Alvaro's accident, at least 6 other jumpers had died in wingsuit flying accidents across the Alps, one in Isère, one in Savoie, one in Haute-Savoie, one near Chamonix, where British stuntman Mark Sutton, the man who had parachuted into the London 2012 Olympic opening ceremony dressed as James Bond, collided with a cliff, and another in the Dolomites where Mario Richard, the husband of climber and base jumper Steph Davis, lost his life. Back in Spain, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Television channels cut to archive footage from Frontier Limite, showing Alvaro in his element, laughing with guests, standing on summits, diving from planes, and colleagues described him as an adventurero sin limits, an adventurer without limits, someone whose whole life had been oriented toward pushing boundaries. Alvaro Bulto died in a valley he thought he knew. Just days earlier, the man who skydived into the Olympics as James Bond had learned the same lesson in the Swiss Alps. More than 1 billion people had seen Mark Sutton jump out of a helicopter as James Bond during the London 2012 Olympic opening ceremony. But just a year later, on what was supposed to be a simple warm-up wingsuit flight in the Swiss Alps, he veered offline at over 150 miles per hour, hit a ridge above the Trient Glacier, and became another name on the growing list of wingsuit flying deaths. He was 42, a former British Army officer from the Gurkha Rifles who had gone on to build a second life as a highly skilled skydiver, base jumper, and stuntman, and while most viewers only knew him as the Bond guy, the people who flew with him knew he had thousands of jumps behind him and a reputation for being calm, precise, and anything but reckless. In July 2012, he and his friend Gary Connery pulled off what many still call one of the greatest live stunts in Olympic history. Daniel Craig's Bond escorts the Queen to a helicopter in a pre-filmed sequence, and then, live over London, 2 figures in a tuxedo and a pink dress leap from a helicopter, glide down under canopy, and land inside the stadium, convincing millions that the Queen herself had just parachuted into the Games. That stunt didn't just require showmanship, it required absolute trust that the jumpers would get every detail right under pressure, and Mark delivered. 13 months later, in August 2013, he was in the Alps for something very different. A 3-day wingsuit gathering near Chamonix and Martigny, where around 20 top wingsuit pilots were invited to jump from helicopters over the Trient area in exchange for accommodation, helicopter time, and the chance to film high-end proximity lines in the French Swiss Alps. The plan for the first day was deliberately conservative. The organisers knew they had many flights ahead, so they chose relatively straightforward terrain instead of ultra-technical lines, trying to avoid the kind of base jumping accidents that had already been making headlines that summer. On August 14, 2013, Mark boarded a helicopter with wingsuit designer Tony Rogallo, both of them wearing multiple cameras. The aircraft climbed to about 3,300 meters, around 10,800 feet, over the Trient Glacier, and the brief was simple. This would be a short, roughly 60-second warm-up flight toward a landing zone near the village of Le Petit on the Swiss side of the Mont Blanc Massif. Imagine that moment from his point of view. He's kneeling at the open door in his wingsuit, feeling the cold air tearing past the fabric, looking down at the glacier and the dark rock ridges cutting through the snow, and going through the same ritual he's practiced on countless jumps. Check the handles, check the rig, picture the line, trust the plan. The route isn't supposed to be extreme. It's a familiar style of wingsuit flying where you follow the terrain with a comfortable safety margin, deploy high enough to handle any issues, and land. He and Tony give each other a final look. The pilot holds the helicopter steady, and then they lean into the void and jump. For the first 20 seconds, everything is exactly as it should be. The wingsuit inflates, Mark accelerates forward and down, and the pair begin their glide, carving along the planned line above the glacier, the ground close enough to feel fast but far enough that, on paper, it shouldn't be dangerous. But then something changes. Accounts from that day say Mark drifted off the intended route and began heading toward a rocky ridge near Les Grands Autines, and at wingsuit speeds, well over 200 kilometers per hour, the difference between close and too close shrinks to almost nothing. Whether it was a tiny misjudgment of distance to the terrain, a subtle wind shift, or a split-second lapse in spatial awareness, in a valley he didn't know as intimately as some of the local flyers, the result was the same. His line carried him closer and closer to the rock, and he didn't have the altitude or time to correct. There was no sign of a parachute deployment, no main and no reserve, because there simply wasn't time to reach for a handle. He hit the ridge with such force that he died instantly. His gear still closed on his back. On the ground, organizers and other pilots saw that something had gone terribly wrong and immediately called for rescue. A helicopter from the Valais police flew in, and when they reached the crash site above Martigny, they found Mark's body on the mountainside and could only confirm that he was dead. The impact so severe that investigators later relied on DNA analysis to formally identify him. Swiss authorities opened an investigation, as they do with all mountain fatalities, but their early statements made it clear they saw this as a straightforward proximity flying death. A very experienced wingsuit pilot who flew into a mountainside at high speed with no evidence of equipment failure or foul play. The organizers described his death as a tragic loss for the wingsuit community, and pointed out that several flights that day had gone smoothly, which made his accident feel even more like the brutal edge case it was. The same line that had been safe for one pilot minutes earlier could become lethal for the next if he was just a few meters off at the wrong moment. For the public, Mark Sutton will always be the anonymous silhouette in a tuxedo dropping into the Olympic Stadium. A clever gag that made everyone laugh and cheer. But the last case today drives the point home that even the most seasoned professionals in a wingsuit can walk right up to death without realizing it. They called him the Birdman of Colombia because he had literally rewritten the Guinness Book for wingsuit flying, but on a training jump in the Swiss Alps in 2015, Jonathan Flores stepped off a cliff in a new racing suit, never made it into stable flight, and slammed into the mountain before he ever had a chance to pull, turning one of the sport's brightest stars into another statistic in the wingsuit flying fatality rate. He was 32 years old, born in Medellin, and he had more than 4,000 skydives and base jumps behind him. So by the time he showed up in Switzerland that summer, he wasn't some kid chasing a YouTube clip. He was a world champion, a Guinness record holder, and a Red Bull-backed pro whose entire life revolved around one question. How far can a human being really fly in nothing but a wingsuit? Jonathan had started skydiving as a teenager and spent more than a decade slowly turning himself into one of the best wingsuit pilots on the planet, and along the way he collected a list of achievements that sounded almost fake when you rattled them off. In April 2012, over La Guajira in northern Colombia, he climbed to airline cruising altitude, around 37,000 feet, in a plane, put on a wingsuit and an oxygen mask, and stepped out into minus 45-degree air to chase 4 Guinness World Records in a single jump. He stayed in freefall for just over 9 minutes, flew farther horizontally and vertically than anyone before him in a wingsuit, and set the mark for the highest wingsuit jump ever done at that time, and then he landed grinning with frost still on his eyebrows. He flew past the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio, over the Nazca lines in Peru, and so close to the Montserrat Church above Bogota that people on the terrace ducked and screamed when he and a friend ripped past the bell tower at around 100 miles per hour. In 2013, he went to Tianmen Mountain in China, raced other elite pilots in the World Wingsuit League, and won. And since there is no Olympic medal for wingsuit flying, he told people that title felt like bringing gold home to Colombia. By mid-2015, he was one of the most recognizable faces in the sport, a guy who could do Hollywood stunts, win competitions, and still joke around on the plane like it was all just a game between friends. That summer he headed to Switzerland to prepare for another big event, a wingsuit race scheduled in China later that year, because if you wanted to sharpen your lines and test new suits, the Alps were where you went. The training ground was Engelberg in the canton of Obwalden, with exits on Mount Titlis, a 3,200 plus meter peak with steep rock faces and complex winds that made it perfect for serious base jumping accidents if you got anything wrong. He wasn't alone. He was training with at least 2 other wingsuiters, working on 3-way formation flying and testing a new prototype racing suit that promised more speed and glide, which also meant less forgiveness if your exit or body position wasn't perfect. On Friday, July 3rd, 2015, they went up again. The plan was simple in theory and deadly in practice. All 3 would exit from Titlis, do a short rock drop to build speed, transition into wingsuit flight, and then fly a line together like they'd been rehearsing. The other 2 jumpers went first and flew their line successfully, disappearing into the valley as they headed for the landing, and Jonathan chose to go last, which meant that once he left the cliff, no one above him would see exactly what happened in those first crucial seconds. From that moment on, there are no direct witnesses, only what rescuers and other pilots pieced together later. Somewhere between the rock and the point where he should have leveled out into full flight, something went wrong. Maybe he caught turbulent air right off the exit. Maybe the new suit needed a cleaner launch than he gave it. Maybe the angle was just a few degrees off, but the result was that he never truly got on the wing. Instead of settling into that stable glide he knew so well, he stayed in a compromised position, losing altitude fast toward hard terrain. Down below, his friends landed and started looking for him in the sky, expecting to see him appear over the valley on schedule, but he never did. They waited, checked the landing area, then realized something had gone very wrong and alerted the Swiss authorities. Search teams fanned out over the slopes below the Titlis exits, and after some hours they found him, Jonathan's body on the mountainside, with signs of a high-speed impact. His parachute had not saved him. Depending on which local report you read, it either never had a chance to open or it opened too late to make any difference. For people inside the community, it looked like a classic example of a wingsuit flying gone wrong at the worst possible point in the sequence. The first seconds after exit, when your suit has to inflate, your body has to find the right angle of attack, and your margin for error is razor thin because there just isn't much altitude under you yet. If you get everything right, you become a tiny fast-moving glider skimming the cliffs. If you get it wrong, you become a base-jumping accident report, and it happens so fast that even the best can't recover. So let us know what you think about these cases in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.